The year is 1852. Saint John Bosco's evening classes at the Oratory were attended by several hundred boys, but they could only house a fraction of them because of limited lodging in their main building, and what rooms there were had been severely damaged by the explosion of a gunpowder factory in Turin. It wasn't long before our saint had gathered enough funds for a new building that would be added on to the old one. But in the middle of construction, there were a series of terrible catastrophes. In this episode, I'll show you how the hand of Divine Providence protected the Oratory boys from a sudden death. The Miracles and Prophecies of Saint John Bosco, a project of America Needs Fatima. I'm your host, Matthew Miller. On Saturday, November 20th, a section of the building under construction collapsed from the height of the third floor when a walkway fell. 3 workers were injured. The consternation and fright of everyone was great. But in the anguish of those moments, Don Bosco raised his eyes to heaven in resignation and uttered the words always on his lips, "God's will be done. Everything as God wills." Without dismay, he commanded that the section of the fallen wall be reconstructed with haste. But a greater loss was reserved for him. When the building was almost finished and awaiting its roof, a violent and prolonged rainstorm halted the work. The downpour continued for several days and nights, and the water washed away the fresh mortar, turning the walls into heaps of bricks and stones, without cement to bind them together. Late in the evening of December 1st, 100 of the city's youngsters were gathered in the Oratory for evening school, and around 9 o'clock they all went home. Don Bosco and his boys were deep asleep when, a little past 11 o'clock, a horrible roar awoke them. The roar was caused by the collapse of the old building adjoining the one under construction. It was a terrible catastrophe as part of the wall toppled to the ground. But the Lord's mercy was apparent. If the collapse had happened 2 hours earlier, how many victims would it have claimed? Don Bosco's mother was about to go to bed. She rushed out of her room, fearing, not without reason, that her son had been buried under the ruins. She cried out as loud as she could, "Don Bosco, get up! Get out! Save yourself!" She ran to the door of the room and called again, but heard no answer. She pushed the door, but it wouldn't open. She saw that a large stone had fallen through the bedroom ceiling, creating a hole through which the rain was now falling. Then she went down the stairs into the kitchen to find the key and try to open that door. Meanwhile, the frightened young men leaped from their beds, some in their sleeping clothes and some in just nightshirts. In complete confusion, still ignorant of what had happened, each wrapped himself in his blankets and sheets as best he could. They evacuated the ground floor dormitories without knowing where to go. Some ran to the gate to escape, while others ran into the church to find shelter at the foot of the altar. Some huddled by the nearby trees, and others finally stopped in the middle of the courtyard. The 50 or so young men running here and there made for a pitiful sight. Some were sobbing, and others screamed. Some fell and sank into the mud, and others fell into puddles of water. They soon realized the cause of the noise, because beams, tiles, and materials now cluttered the ground. All the young men were calling for Don Bosco and waiting for Mother Margarita, who took the keys to his room. Then they heard the familiar sound of a small bell, and a lamp appeared at the end of the balcony. It was Don Bosco, who now quietly left his room and came down to inspect the ruins. He had been half awake when he heard the first rumbling, and, as he listened, heard another great rumble that sounded like thunder. But not seeing lightning, he realized he was indeed in danger because his room was closest to the new building. As soon as he appeared, the boys shouted, "Don Bosco! Oh, Don Bosco's saved!" And forgetting the mud and the rubble, they ran to him and surrounded him. One said, "Don Bosco, did you not hear the wall crashing down or your mother's cries?" Another asked Don Bosco whether he suffered much or had hurt himself. A third wondered why he did not immediately leave his room. A fourth told him, "See how our feet and legs are bruised?" Each boy competed to tell Don Bosco about his dexterity, his athletic prowess, and somersaults to escape that night's danger. Don Bosco listened patiently and answered with consoling words without any disquiet, with that calmness proper to the faithful servants of God and people of peace. He first asked whether any misfortune had befallen the boys. Hearing that no injury had disturbed the children of the oratory other than the building's collapse, he became jubilant. He started teasing them about how they looked in the aftermath of the event. He chuckled at the fear of one boy and jested about the improvised bedding covering another. Ultimately, he invited them to go throughout the courtyard to greet one another. His calm spirit greatly soothed the young men amid their great dismay. Then he led them into the dining room and told them the oratory had already suffered persecution and tense situations. Nevertheless, it flourished and grew every day. Therefore, he asked them all to keep their trust in Divine Providence. He said, "Now that we have received this grace and are all unharmed, let us recite the litanies." At his invitation, all fell to their knees, reciting the litanies with him in thanksgiving to the Lord, who had not allowed anyone to be crushed under the ruins. At that same instant, Don Bosco was thinking seriously, "And now where do we go? What should we do?" The night was dark. It was raining. It was cold. For some time, however, they had heard no more ominous noises. Don Bosco continued to consider the situation and realized that whatever was unstable had finished collapsing. No significant damage had appeared on the side of the house where everyone slept. It was already half an hour past midnight, and Don Bosco wanted everyone to get the rest they needed. He told the young men, "It's time for you to go quietly back to sleep. Be assured that no misfortune will happen to you. Remove your beds from that unstable room with all possible caution. Move some to the sacristy, and come here to the refectory." It was no sooner said than it was done. In the blink of an eye, everyone disappeared and flew off to load their beds on their shoulders. Anyone who had seen how easily and swiftly they carried their belongings would have thought that they were a group of soldiers, because they were so quick and efficient. In less than a quarter of an hour, 20 beds were moved to the new quarters. Mother Margarita was displaying a stout courage worthy of high praise. She ensured that no one approached the danger zone, distributed the youngsters to their rooms, and kept watch until dawn, moving like a general on a battlefield. In her, anyone could see a true mother whose love made her forget herself and care only about her children. And Don Bosco showed himself worthy of such a mother. He repeatedly risked his own life to secure the boys' lives, going around to see if any further collapse was imminent. Don Bosco urged the young men to lie down, and he made a short prayer and returned to his room, which was still unstable. All the others gradually imitated him in returning to bed to try to sleep, except for a few who withdrew to the church to pray. In the morning, everyone described the continual overnight noises caused by bricks, stones, beams, and planks falling from the destruction overhead. By 5 in the morning, most of the boys were already in the courtyard to look at the rubble. Then, at about 5:30, the middle wing collapsed. It fell on the central and higher portion. This caused noise 4 times as loud as the first, with such a tremor that it made the house shake for several minutes. Those still dozing in bed leaped to their feet, dressed, and went down to see what had happened. But Don Bosco had abandoned himself into God's hands. Having already descended into the church, he calmly had the young men assemble. He invited them to thank the Lord for having escaped so miraculously. Then he celebrated Holy Mass. He came out of church amid all the boys and smiled, exclaiming, "The devil has done this to me because he doesn't want me to enlarge the oratory and gather new young men. But we will do it to spite him. The devil wanted to kick us, but rest assured the Lord is stronger than he is, and the devil will not prevent God's work." Before long, the courtyard was packed with people who had come to see the ruined building out of curiosity. The mayor came with 2 municipal engineers, and they comforted Don Bosco by assuring him that the misfortune would not harm the oratory. So immediately, the 2 engineers began inspecting the cause of the disaster. As we have heard, the new building was annexed to the old one. Over Don Bosco's room towered a tall pillar left after the collapse, which hung frighteningly over the ruined old building. One of the engineers carefully examined that pillar and, biting his lip, asked Don Bosco, "Who slept there?" "About 30 of us did," Don Bosco replied. The engineer took Don Bosco by the arm and said, "You and your boys should thank Our Lady. The way that pillar stands defies the laws of gravity. If it had fallen, it would have crushed you and the boys. It's a true miracle." Orders were quickly given to demolish it. Taking the necessary precautions, the stonemasons secured it tightly with large ropes and then, having climbed the walkways, undid the knots little by little, lowering the pillar gently and saving the old building from ruin. With cheerful countenance and kind words, Don Bosco encouraged his boys. He said, "Let us take everything that happens to us from the hand of God, and I assure you that the Lord will hold our resignation in high regard. We must thank the Lord and the Blessed Virgin because, amid these sad events, God's benevolent and providential hand has mitigated our misfortune." He then said to himself, "Nothing troubles you, for he who has God has everything. The Lord is the master of the house. I am a humble servant. What pleases the master pleases me." Thank you all for watching, and if you'd like to see a playlist about the cholera epidemic, in which Don Bosco and his boys did many good works, just click on the link I've put on the screen. God bless you, and Our Lady keep you.